Now, obviously, that's an English translation, but pretty much, well, everyone translates it as descended from David. Why? Well, because the Greek refers to him coming from the sperma from the seed of David. And all through the Septuagint and in various other places, we have a reference. We have references to people being descended from an ancestor using this terminology. It's a figurative terminology referring, obviously, to seed, semen. But what it means is, in all of those hundreds of other references, it means that he's descended from an ancestor.
Tim O'Neill seems to make a very common mistake frequently, which leads me to believe that he doesn't think it's a mistake. He will often compare Paul's Greek text to older Septuagint scripture texts as if they would be writing in the exact same way. If Tim O'Neill had any kind of understanding or training in textual criticism, he would understand that that's not how you analyze what an author could mean with the words that he uses. You compare that author to other things that author has written. This is surprising coming from Tim because he normally follows in lockstep with Dr. Bart Ehrman, but even Dr. Ehrman would disagree with Tim's methodology at this point.
But that's not the reason for doing it. The reason for doing it is because you want to see what an author says. When I read Charles Dickens, I just don't assume he's saying the same thing as George Eliot, or that Mark Twain is saying the same thing as T.S. Eliot. I mean, it's like you let each author have his own say. And if it turns out they contradict each other, that's worth noting. But that's not why you're doing it. You're doing it to see what an author has to say.
So we can't know what Paul meant by a word or phrase by comparing him to how authors of the Septuagint translation of the Hebrew Bible would have used them. Tim makes this basic-ass mistake all throughout this video, and we'll see that he is not going to learn from his mistakes. He is going to keep on repeating these mistakes because he does so in this very interview.
Now, that makes perfect sense if Paul, whether he's right or not, if Paul actually believed that Jesus was somehow descended from David, and if Paul believed, as he seems to have, that Jesus had been a recent historical earthly person. But that means mythicism is wrong. So they have to find a way to deal with this pretty clear reference to Jesus being descended from a human ancestor. You can't be descended from a human ancestor if you're not a human.
So my primary source for information on this topic is Dr. Carrier's On the Historicity of Jesus, along with some other information that I've accumulated while researching. If you read chapter 11, section 9, titled Women and Sperm, you will find Dr. Carrier carefully exploring all options for Romans 1:3. Dr. Carrier concludes his discussion on Romans 1:3 by saying this:
But arguing a fortiori, I shall set the latter probability at 50% against a 100% probability on minimal historicity. Thus, although I do not believe this counts as evidence for historicity at all, I am willing to allow that it might, in those proportions. In other words, although I doubt it, these vague passages might be twice as likely on historicity. Richard Carrier on the Historicity of Jesus, page 838.
You can tell that Dr. Carrier is not trying to justify a predetermined conclusion. He is evaluating all the evidence that we have. He doesn't ignore solutions or any supporting information. Yet, Tim is portraying Dr. Carrier as trying to justify his mythicism. At what point in Dr. Carrier's analysis of this verse do you see him at all doing anything remotely like just trying to justify mythicism? If you've honestly read the position, I don't see how you could make this basic-ass mistake.
And the way that Carrier does it is he says, well, Paul uses the same verb, form of the same verb, ginomai, when he's talking about Adam being made by God. And Adam wasn't born. Adam was actually shaped, made by God. So therefore, he's saying that Jesus was shaped by God. He wasn't born. and therefore he was somehow shaped from, manufactured from the seed of David. How could that be? And then he comes up with this elaborate fantasy about how what Paul is saying here implicitly is that God gathered actual semen from the testicles of King David, stored it in a magical sperm bank in the heavens, and that's Carrier's terminology, and then used it to create a fleshly body of Jesus in the heavens that was then the one that was crucified and all that stuff.
So the words that Paul uses and how Paul describes Jesus' body is a major part of the argument. But there are other reasons to doubt the allegorical interpretation of this phrase. The fact that Paul consistently describes Jesus' body just like Adam's body and our future resurrection bodies is a fact that you can't just simply ignore. You can't ignore passages like Philippians 2:6-8, where Paul still uses genomai in reference to Jesus' body, which is rendered in the Greek interlinear text as being made in the likeness of men, not born. So it's a cumulative case, analyzing the allegorical interpretation and finding that it lacks sufficient explanatory power. It's very obvious that a literal interpretation of this phrase has far more scriptural support than an allegorical one. How can Tim call this sperm collection an elaborate fantasy as if it doesn't have any kind of basis in the evidence? It does. We read the source for this idea, and this whole idea influenced later Jews to develop even more elaborate myths about sperm collection. In Galatians 1:14, Paul admits to being a well-educated Jew and that he has advanced his Judaism far past many of his peers. Tim is suggesting that Paul, despite knowing the scriptures, seemed to not know about 2 Samuel 7:12-14. You know, the passage that has God collecting David's semen and then using it to create future descendants that will sit upon an eternal throne. Does that sound familiar to you? How can you read this passage and be able to sit there and say that this was definitely not the subject of Pesher creation? I think it's totally absurd to suggest that a Jew specifically searching the scriptures for hidden information about the Messiah to not read this passage as being about the Messiah. It's a preposterous assumption with no basis in fact.